Well, anyway, Kanye West can't leave an amazing career alone, and he is going to buy Parler, which apparently Candace Owens' husband, George Farmer, had created. So he's going to buy his own social network. If you don't remember, Parler is like a really shitty version of Twitter that never seems to have worked or been stable. It crashed the first 10 times I used it. Miraculously, this steaming pile of garbage had raised $56 million in funding. And Kanye is on a social media tour saying horrific anti-Semitic stuff. He seems to be having a mental breakdown again. There's a big discussion now, I guess. Should people be platforming them to the point that he's doing 3, 4, 5-hour interviews with people? And it does seem like it's acute mental illness / breakdown. I don't want to diagnose anybody from afar here, and I'm not qualified to do that.
But you just did.
Well, I mean, he has been public about his struggles with mental illness.
It's not a huge leap for any of us that have had family members have manic episodes. I mean,
it's clearly a manic episode.
It's pretty much right out of the textbook.
So my question for you guys is, what you have somebody with great wealth, great creativity. He's obviously a savant in so many different categories, with a huge social media following, plus money, plus fame. And then you add social media to the mix, which is an accelerant. And then all of these, Tucker Carlson and every other publication, every podcast using this moment, I think in a way to kind of, get ratings off of this train wreck. I find it abhorrent to interview somebody when they're in a manic episode like this. I'll be totally honest. I wouldn't do it. What is your take on this?
I have a family member, a blood relative, that is in severe mental health crisis. If the emails and the text messages that this person sent were public, I read these things and they've severely impacted me to the point now where I have a rule that when they're in a manic episode, I just kind of harvest them and archive them just in case something bad happens. But I can't even take the effort to read it, and because it takes such a toll. And then I feel really guilty because I think maybe there's something in there where I could be missing something. So this is what, when you're in the middle of a severe episode, this is what the family and the loved ones of that person is also dealing with. So I have no idea what's happening with Kanye, but what I would tell you is, when you're in a manic episode, the thing that you need is for the people around you to try to step in to help you. And it's really freaking hard. And I can tell you that I've seen this person in my family say things and do things that are just so beyond the pale.
Yeah.
And it's part of when they're in that moment. And the whole goal is to try to get them out, get them back on their meds, get them rebalanced. It's a really, really complicated thing to deal with.
Well, look, I mean, the guy's buying a social media platform. I think it continues to support the point that I've made a few times, which is I don't think that anyone has a monopoly in social media networks. We've seen every couple of years competitors emerge, people proclaim monopoly. Those monopolies get destroyed by the next thing, from Friendster to MySpace to Facebook to Instagram to Snapchat to TikTok. And I think that the reality is the users of those platforms ultimately coalesce around a set of standards they want to see happen on that platform. And those standards become kind of the editorialized or produced model for how that platform should operate. Because that's what the users say. They don't want anti-Semitism. They don't want what they would call kind of challenging an institution. They don't want fake news, whatever the classification is. There is an editor or an editorial board that editorializes what is and isn't allowed to be said on that platform. And ultimately, there is a fringe voice or a voice that feels unheard or feels like it cannot speak on that platform. And what we're seeing now with, I think, Elon acquiring Twitter and Kanye acquiring Parler, and generally a number of kind of emerging networks like what's it called, Rumbler, as an alternative to YouTube, is a really clear indication.
Maybe.
What's it called?
Rumble, I think.
Rumble. Yeah, it's really clear. I think it's a really clear supporting fact that there are going to be alternatives, and that these what we thought were monopolies and what kind of became digital town squares and almost infrastructure are really just application layers. They're editorialized, and there are going to be competitors. And I think there are folks that want to have a voice that feel like they've been editorialized out of the existing networks, like Kanye, like Trump, like Elon to some degree. And they're, those that have resources are changing that. And I think that speaks to a really healthy competitive market. So having folks like Kanye step in and try and create a new platform that has alternative voices. Long term, I believe in freedom of speech. I believe that we should have alternative voices. But I also believe that consumers and customers should be able to choose what platform they want to be on based on the editorialization that happens on those platforms. And I do believe that the owners of those platforms should have their own rules because it creates a differentiated product.
Jason, is that what you were hoping to get comment on, or this idea of the media feeding frenzy, feeding on Kanye's mental breakdown?
Yeah, I was talking about the media frenzy. That's the thing that I think is pretty abhorrent here. In fact, YouTube just pulled a bunch of the interviews he did recently because there's so much anti-Semitic stuff in it. And, when somebody's in a mental breakdown like this, which I think it's pretty clear he's in, they do this behavior, and of course it's hurting them. It's to your point, I'm sure it's hurting his kids or ex-wives or ex-wife. And,
can I ask who's to
it's
decide,
going to blow
JKL?
back. What's that?
Can I ask, who do you think is to decide that? Because he's done interviews where he said, I have episodes, and those episodes actually provide me with creativity and brilliance.
I think it's up to the person who is the host of that show who has to make an editorial decision. And so Tucker Carlson's going for ratings, or if somebody else does it and they want the ratings because Kanye's a big name, that's, I get it. He's a great get, right? And if you're somebody who likes to interview people, that's like a lifetime get. That could be the get that, makes people learn about your podcast. I just think it's unethical to do that when somebody is suffering like that, to then feature them and to platform them in order to get your own ratings. That's a personal decision. I would never do it.
Let me ask you a different question, though. So
no, I wouldn't do it.
Would you hold him accountable for what he said?
Well, this is the nuance, and I think we do have to think about that because anti-Semitism exists in the world. He's got a big fan base. That means if he's got people in his fan base who are also having a manic episode, they could then be inspired by what he's saying to do something horrific and cause real world harm. And this is where, the accelerant of social media, I think, is particularly dangerous, Chamath. In the old days, if somebody said this stuff on a talk show, maybe they don't air it, or they say it, it's in the newspapers. But when he can have a continuing dialogue across many podcasts a week, he's done like 10 podcasts in the last week. He'll go on air with anybody. And then he has tens of millions of followers. He's reaching hundreds of millions of people. All you need is one person who's mentally ill to then go do some horrible thing in the world that we've seen happen many times. And that's what I'm concerned about. You have to understand it's the law of big numbers, basically, Chamath. There's a large number of people. Yeah.
Just to give you a sense of it, when this family member of mine, we've had to have interventions. We've had police. We've had the government get involved in Canada. We had their driver's license taken away. It is an unbelievably complicated set of interventions. And I am so thankful that she doesn't have massive social media awareness, because it would just be chaos. And I would hate that, because of their association to me, that this person gets more attention than they should in a moment where what they really need is help. And I think that should be the governing principle in moments like this, where if a bunch of your family members or your healthcare providers or whatever can raise their hand and say, hey, hold on a second, this is completely off the rails. Friedberg, to your point, I don't think that editorial freedom matters in that point. I think there's just a more humane idea around get this person off the airwaves and allow themselves to get out of that loop.
Settle down. Yeah. Yeah.
And typically what happens is that, these folks, at least again, just in my experience, will have titrated a medicine well. And then when that titration fails, their ability to regulate their emotions fail. And this is the loop that they enter. Mm-hmm. And, you really have to find a way of taking all of these mechanisms off the table so that they can re-regulate themselves. Yeah. And I think that as a society, we have to sort of move towards that, so that if, family members can call Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever and say, listen, or the doctor, here's the doctor's note. You have to be able to shut this stuff down because you have to mute all of these other things so that this person can then get back into a mode where they re-regulate. That should be the priority.
Yeah. Compassion for the person. Yeah.
It's not forgiving what they say, but it is having maybe a little bit more compassion in that moment to get them back to their true self.
I think this one's a little easy to say, hey, Kanye's having a mental breakdown because he's talked about mental illness in the past. It's a lot harder to make these, supposed determinations as a reporter or a podcast host. If someone says something crazy, and then it's easy to raise your hand and say, hey, they're crazy, cut it out, or there's some mental health issue going on here.
But Friedberg, if he's not having a mental issue right now, then he is a horrible human being who is an anti-Semite, who is spreading just the most vitriolic, horrible things and tropes you could ever imagine at a time when, there's enough division in the country and somebody could get hurt, So in either case, his accounts have to get paused if he's going to say anti-Semitic stuff on them.
There's really clear guidelines across all these platforms on what's inappropriate, and certainly I think folks will start to adhere to them.
I guess if I had anything to contribute, I think Chamath said this well about a mental health angle, but what I would say is I actually think that the social platforms have done a reasonably good job. The fact that he's buying Parler, I think, is evidence of the fact that there actually is an editorial layer.
Yeah.
That's doing a reasonable job. It's a tough decision. There's always going to be a long tail of podcasts. Somebody will go grift off of, an episode or whatever. But I think, a few years ago, we were talking about no editorial standards. And I think today, across these platforms, obviously there's a tension. There's a tension that's existed for 100 years plus around free speech on these platforms. I get that tension. But I think a little credit where credit's due. We're not seeing these memes spread like wildfire, in part because the platforms with the most reach are doing their job.